I am Dr. Annabelle Show-Mimo. I'm a sexual health doctor, and I will let Rihanna and Phil introduce themselves. But essentially, we have collaborated with SOSSU, and we've done a few events, and it's been a really busy 12 months because we started here 12 months ago, speaking about colonisation within sexual health. And then over the last 12 months, it's been really great. Loads of people over sexual reproductive health have joined us and added their experiences and their voices. So SOSSU asked us to come back and do an event that's centred more on the Black experience, especially during Black History Month. So I've got a bit sick of panels. So what we've done, kind of tried to do, so hopefully it works, is we've pulled quotes from history that kind of like resonate with us in terms of sexual reproductive health and why we do what we do. And then we're going to use that to expand conversation. And we're going to try and make it quite an open conversation. So I'll use my quotes, and Rihanna will use her quotes, Phil will use her quotes, and then we'll kind of just open it up to the floor about different experiences that people have had. And then afterwards, you can have a chat. Obviously, there are some drinks at the back, and we're going to be talking to people about their sexual health, and we'll all introduce a bit about ourselves so you know kind of what our expertise are. And there's other people here floating that also work in sexual reproductive health and also have knowledge to give you or can answer questions about decolonising contraception. So Decolonising Contraception essentially started from a Galvin article series that I was writing about sexual health. And then it resonated with lots and lots of people, and people wanted us to do more stuff around it. So we started doing actual practical events because it was important. I thought some of the conversations, people were slipping into my DMs, and I was like, this is a bit, you should probably just have this chat in person. So that's what we've kind of decided to do. So we're now a collective of sorts that all do stuff in sexual reproductive health, and we're trying to do it in interesting ways. And some of us shout on Twitter a lot, like Phil and I. Other people do things that are probably a bit more productive. Okay, so, freeze, is this frozen? Oh, going forward, going backwards. Yeah, so yes, as I mentioned, I'm Dr. Annabelle Show-Mimo. I'm a community sexual reproductive health doctor, and I guess started this collective, and I also write, and I write for Galvin, I write for Black Ballad, and then I freelance and I write for The Independent and some like other platforms. So, to start with, this is essentially a quote from Black Women's Lives in Britain, which is a book that's written by some of OAD, who were a collective kind of in the 80s that did loads about like reproductive justice and reproductive rights. And I thought I'd use this to kickstart and also use this to kind of describe what we're trying to do. So many paternal and apparently sympathetic doctors have persuaded Black women to accept an abortion or contraception she did not really want out of a concern to control our fertility. And such attitudes are reflected not only through our experiences here in Britain, but in our countries of origin, where myths are the need for population control, where myths about the need for population control are used as an excuse for unleashing of mass sterilisation and birth control programmes on Black and third world women, often as part of the West's aid package. So quite a long quote, they're not all this long. So in terms of this quote, and I've used it in loads of talks before, I think why it's so key is that this book was written in like 1984. By Black women that were quite seen as radical women, and they themselves think they were radical women, about reproductive rights and justice and how they felt their experiences were today and how that linked to kind of colonialism and coloniality. And what is really interesting is that we're like 20, 30 years down the line, and I actually feel that I'm having the same conversation and how actually nothing's changed. So in terms of decolonising contraception, I'm very, very aware of my privilege as like somebody that's middling, a middle class doctor, and speaking about this issue. Now, part of the reason that this person, this collective of women were probably not taken as seriously is because they didn't have that privilege and couldn't articulate it in the way I did in those spaces. So people will automatically probably dismiss somebody, or can use that to dismiss somebody by saying that you don't understand, you're not part of the establishment, or you don't have the education or the intellect to actually know what this is really about, and maybe this is some of the reason why this conversation hasn't been moving forward. Not necessarily, just one of the ideas that I had. And then the reason I think this really resonates is that, and we'll get into like other people's experiences if they want to share, is that I see so frequently in my practice like the idea that we're, as medics, don't necessarily have your best interests or somebody's best interests at heart, that we're actually trying to use contraception because we think, oh, like it's a young woman, you don't know what you're doing. Actually, we don't actually really know what that contraception or that tablet will do to you, but we're going to give it to you because like it's the best that we have, but we don't actually know all of it, which sometimes, you know, our information is limited. But that's quite a pervasive thing that I see within the Black community, that like we as medical professionals should be kind of like, we should be wary of you because actually you're only telling us a half-assed truth. And that's why I think this is really important, and one of the reasons that I kind of founded DC. So I thought that quote was quite important to bring up. And then the third thing that I wanted to bring out in this quote was essentially the last bit about control of programs of Black and third world women being used as the West Aid package, because actually this is something that actually manifests today. So hands up, does anybody know what the global gag rule is? Yeah, you do? Okay. So the global gag rule is something that's existed since the 1980s, which is essentially, not 1980s, before that, it was President Reagan that introduced it in the US, which is essentially that any aid program, don't worry, it's supposed to be more chill than this, we're like sitting in a lecture format, but anyway. So any, the US does not give aid to any sexual reproductive health program that mentions abortion rights, and that's why it's called the global gag rule, but it's also known as the Mexico City policy. And that doesn't matter if the charity also does like HIV work or does like loads of other stuff around sexual reproductive health. If they mention abortion or they talk about it, they can't have money. So every time you get a Republican president, they introduce that rule, and Trump has actually extended the capacity, like how stringent that policy is. And why that's really important is because the US provides quite a sizable amount of funding, and in some countries up to like 80-90% of their sexual reproductive health funding and services are funded by USAID. So as soon as the gag rule comes in, you have whole countries, usually smaller countries like Madagascar, for example, that cannot supply family planning, STI services because they've had their funding removed because they're not allowed to talk about abortion. So what happens is that populations that are dependent on those services for condoms or contraception don't get them, and so indirectly you have a country like the US controlling the reproduction agenda of countries across the world. So it's talking about things like that as well that's still happening today and how that affects us and people don't really realise. Okay, so I use that to kind of just introduce decolonising contraception and some of like the weightier topics that I also want to discuss, while there's just some of the the straightforward ones. Before I go any further with my quotes and actually ask if you have any feedback on that, I just wanted to make sure that Rihanna and Phil had introduced themselves, which I rushed into. So do you guys want to do your own introduction?
So good evening, everyone. My name is Rihanna Raymond-Williams. I'm a writer, researcher and social entrepreneur from East London. I'll start with that as introduction, but I'll be talking more about my work later on, I guess.
Hello everyone, my name is Phil Samba. I'm a social activist and a writer, and I'm a project lead for a project at Prepstar, which is basically an organization that agitates and educates about PrEP, and I run a project on queer men of color.
Cool. Okay, thank you guys. So moving back to this quote, before I move on, and how I'm going to do this, and I feel like panels can get a bit boring, so as I said, I'm going to try and keep this interactive. Does anybody actually have any thoughts or anything that they want to bring in at this stage about this quote, or even like why they're here, or any of the stuff I kind of discussed? You do? Phil? Yeah, Nina, go on, yeah.
The person that said this, where were they, what country were they from?
So this book,
Is this collectively?
so exactly, so in terms of it's Beverly, I'm really bad with names, but basically it's it was written by the kind of some of the founders of OAD, so that was a British collective in the 80s that was essentially established to talk about reproductive rights and a lot of different rights that were affecting women at the time, and OAD stands for like the Association of Women of African and Asian Descent, essentially. And now Stella Dadzi, who was one of the authors of that book, works more in race and curriculum and teaching and like decolonising curriculum and stuff like that. So that's what she does now. But it was written from like a black British women's experience, and I think that's why I really wanted to bring it out, because so often we draw on things from an American context, but we do actually have our own history, and people have been talking about these things for quite some time. Cool. So I am going to move on then, if nobody has anything. Don't worry, we'll open it up to the floor. So does anybody know about Henrietta Lacks? Yes, yeah, little waves, little nods. Okay, so I was like, should I put this in? Should I go somewhere else with this? But actually, the reason I put it in is because of like, I'm trying to talk a little bit also about my journey and the journey into decolonising contraception, as well as like black history. So Henrietta Lacks essentially was an African American woman that went into hospital in, I'd like to say the 1950s. I'm really dodgy with dates, okay, but she went in to hospital and she was suffering from really bad pelvic pain, essentially, and at the time they thought she was pregnant, and she did actually turn out to be pregnant, but she also turned out to have uterine cancer, and this ended up killing her in the end, but yes? Oh yeah, okay, it was cervical cancer. It was cervical cancer. My details are a bit like, yeah, I read her book like, I read the book about her life about 9 years ago. But essentially what they did is they harvested her cells to utilise in kind of medical research, and they're known as HeLa cells. And they've been used all over the world for like various different aspects of medical interventions. And there's kind of lots of different kind of experiments within medicine that have kind of a similar context, which I'll go into in a little bit. But the thing that's most striking about Henrietta Lacks' story is essentially the cells were taken from her. There wasn't really any due consent process. No one knew that they had taken these cells. A bit of her biology has essentially been replicated all over the world, and medicine and medical science has been allowed to thrive from that and from her essentially giving her life. And she obviously didn't receive necessarily the care that it may not have made much difference, but she didn't really have a very nice life, and she didn't really receive very good care. And then this is a quote from the book, which is written by someone called Rebecca Scoots. She's the most important person in the world, and her family are living in poverty. If our mother is so important in science, why can't we get health insurance? And obviously we're really lucky in the UK, we have the NHS, but obviously we still have massive health disparities, and services are very different in different parts of the country, which is another thing that people always don't like to bring up and mention. But in terms of Henrietta Lacks' story, it's so important because it's not just, she's one example, and somebody made a book about her life, because they felt that it needed to be out there that she had been utilised in this way. However, there are so many stories like this in terms of how medicine has proceeded and operated on black and brown bodies. For example, like Tuskegee trials, how we know everything about syphilis. That was through experimentation on African American men. In the South, they had syphilis. They developed a cure for syphilis whilst this trial was going on in the form of a quick penicillin injection. They weren't given that injection. A lot of them developed complications, and as a result, lots of them died from syphilis complications or associated causes. And as a result, the only way they were acknowledged when this was uncovered, and some of their family got really minuscule compensation. So some of what we're doing, and I guess what the point of having these conversations, I don't just talk at these events, I'm like trying to talk to medical professionals as well, is like trying to say, do you know actually where your knowledge comes from? And if you don't know where your knowledge comes from, it sounds like really far-fetched to people, but like you can just repeat these processes. And actually, I feel that in terms of like the global south and stuff, we still do repeat those processes because we do global health and we do experiments overseas, and often the ethics process is not quite the same process. So that's why I thought that quote was really important, because it brings up her history, but also relates to a lot of the experimentation and problems that we see in terms of relationship between patients, doctors, scientists. But other people in the room might know more about Henrietta Lacks or have like more opinions in terms of how her life manifested. Did anybody have anything that they wanted to? Yeah?
So, my name is Felicia, I'm also a doctor. I remember when I first started doing research, we were given HeLa cells to work with.
Yeah.
And there was no discussion whatsoever about where these cells came from. And I only actually found out about her life, I was quite young at the time, I only found out a couple of years later. I've been really shocked and appalled. First of all, that even now, there's no discussion around where these cells come from. There doesn't seem to have been any sort of compensation to her family. There's never really been an apology either. And secondly, where we get these cells from, they're kept in these huge cell banks, and people make so much money from them, like so much money. And it just as a gesture of goodwill to her family, who do live in poverty, just to say, your mother has contributed so much to science, and the fact that you're living in these conditions is disgraceful. It would be like a drop in the ocean to them. But there just seems to be no respect towards the fact that she didn't really consent to giving these cells anyway, and they're still being used to make lots and lots of people very, very rich.
And I hear all of that as well, and just really great points. In terms of like how, as a doctor and also like as a researcher, because I know you researched that, how has that made you feel in terms of like your interaction with your profession? Because, you know, me, myself, like we're in a system, right? And a lot of the stuff that we're using, we don't actually know how we got it, you know? And sometimes like by just being in the system, like, are you complicit?
It's really difficult.
Did you use the HeLa cells?
I did.
You did.
Exactly. But I didn't know about the history of them at the
Time, fair.
I don't know if my opinion would have been different, or if I still would have. Because the other thing is we've got other conditions like, there are quite a lot of conditions that we know about because of horrible experiments that were done on people in World War II as well, that were done on, and they're named, a lot of the conditions are named after the Nazis.
Yeah, they are.
found
Some of
out
them have
that-
been we're starting to rename them though.
So they're being renamed. Not all of them have been renamed. And
No.
still, the old terminology is still used, and we still use a lot of that research for things that inform us today. Like NASA, the space program, a lot of that was based on research that was done on people in Nazi Germany that they didn't, obviously was incredibly unethical.
Yeah.
So I can't answer whether or not I would have used HeLa cells or not.
Thank you for that, and I think that's a really pertinent point, and usually I bring up at the beginning that colonisation is a process that has occurred through a lot of that's happened to non-white people and white people over time, and it's not something that's like obviously unique to like a black and brown experience. The reason that obviously decolonising work often focuses on non-white people is because of what I personally believe is a process to not assimilate. So you can't really change your skin tone. Some groups are clearly visibly othered, which means that after colonisation kind of like occurs, the effects are kind of long lasting in terms of like stereotypes, in terms of your interactions with people, because you will always be othered as a result. So it's not to think, obviously I'm sure all of you know this already, but like colonisation hasn't just been restricted to like people of colour and people that are visibly other, but sometimes we are the people that suffer worse from it because we can't just like assimilate into the demographic that we've been moved towards, and then we have to kind of deal with the consequences of possibly being demeaned and prejudiced against and things. So yeah, I don't know, does anybody have any thoughts before I move on? I'm going to hand over to you guys after my last quote and things about renaming things and if they think they help. In terms of, we just like kind of had a bit of chat about how some of the conditions within medicine have been linked towards experimentation with like Nazi Germany and are named after Nazis who experimented on Jewish people to derive their information, and like people trying to reclaim those. Like, would it be helpful if we reclaimed some of these things that are named after people and called it something else? I mean, in this case, HeLa cells are really called after her, and it's not really helped at all. Yeah.
I think when I was studying, it was a lot of, there was a lot of syndromes that were named after all these scientists that supposedly discovered them. I never understood why you couldn't just make a name for that disease without having to call this person that we don't know whether it was a bad person, a good person, or what kind of medical studies they ever went to come up with this disease. I mean, it is good to rename the diseases, but at the same time, like,
Why did we do it in the first place? You know what? It's something that's always sat really badly with me. So they're called eponymous syndromes, essentially syndromes that are named after people within medicine. And there was a section, like most medics walk around with this like Oxford handbook where it's like our Bible of everything is in there. And there's like a little section at the back called like eponymous syndromes. And like you seem really clever if you're like, I don't know, Silver's syndrome is blah, 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 you know? And I think it really all just goes back to how medicine is really patriarchal and is quite embedded in arrogance, to be honest. Like, people like things named after them. No, it does, because why can't you name stuff after sometimes the people who gave their life or died of that syndrome but didn't get a cure? Why is it named after you? It's really quite strange. And there are other things that I think reflect this. Like, I'm not sure if any of you read this story, but I think it was at the Royal Free. I don't want to defame the Royal Free, but there was a liver surgeon that did a transplant in the Royal Free a few years ago, and he's been struck off now, but he signed his initials on the transplanted liver. Yeah, he transplanted the liver and then did his like signature on the liver, and it's just like gone mad, you know. Like, now that's not common, obviously, and he was struck off, but I think that really goes back to a narcissism that I think is quite deeply ingrained, especially in like old school medicine. And this is why people used to name things after themselves. It was like accolade, it was funfair. After I'm dead, all of these people with, I don't know, you know, Sjogren's syndrome, which is like a niche kind of autoimmune thing, are going to know that it was me forever, you know? And I think that's what it goes back to be quite honest. And I do think people have to really challenge that. That is where it comes from. And I think people do it less, but it's still it's still an ongoing process. So there's been a lot of me chatting, so I'm just going to move on to my last quote. And that's the book, if anybody wants to pick it up. We don't have it today, but we have a bookshelf, which you can look at afterwards, and we do have a reading list on our website of texts that kind of relate to our work and that are like interesting, that you can learn more about. So this is just like the last one, and that for me I wanted to kind of round up on. And it's again kind of talking about like why I'm doing what I do and why I guess kind of what other people here might do what they do. So this is from Lily Allen. She was an African American woman who founded I think it's the National Black Women's Association, like in the 80s in the US. When there was a lot of kind of ongoing struggle about kind of abortion rights in the US and it being quite white and people not recognizing that the people that needed these rights the most were black women and women of color who were living in poverty, so they kind of tried to set up their own organization and made it a national thing. And from that, she kind of developed different strategies about talking about sexual health. She said, build a group of young people looking at the issues of birth control, not just by looking at what contraceptives they can and don't use, but looking at birth control from a place of what they want in their lives. I wanted them to understand how to have a life, What are the things that they must have in place to assure their vision? So if you don't want to have children, are you just talking about birth control? You have to first talk about your life and how you feel about your life and how you feel about your life and having a future and what the elements of that are, that should say. Sorry. And the reason that this text really like resonated with me is because I think so much professionally, and when I look at interventions, they're really fixated on the problem. So often it's like, oh, this demographic are having too many children, or there's like, this is fact, like the rate of gonorrhea is like 10 times higher amongst black men, and that's really awful. And then people are really fixated on addressing that specific issue without kind of contextualizing the problem and thinking about that person's life and why that person actually is having multiple partners, why that person can't use a condom. Like, I met a young man in clinic maybe actually like a year ago now, and you know, we have limited time in clinic and it's really sad, and like I want to spend more time with some people. And he it was a young black man, and he came in, and I can't remember, I think he had symptoms. I don't think I actually knew what he wanted, what he had. We had to send off his tests, but I was just asking about his life, and he was essentially like, I'm sofa surfing, right? So he was, and as lots of young people are now, and you know, he was like, I'm sleeping with women that I don't really want to sleep with because I need to sleep somewhere. I don't want to sleep on the street. So I'm going to have sex with people that I don't want to have sex with because I know that if I hang around and have sex with them for like a few weeks, then I have somewhere to stay. And you know, that was really devastating to hear because we know kind of what some of the problems are, but like when someone sat there and like, you can't really do anything. If they're a younger person, sometimes like when they're below 16 or they're 16, 17, then you can do more around safeguarding. But when it's an adult, it's incredibly difficult to sometimes help people like that because there aren't actually the social structures, because actually that person is seen as of their own volition, kind of having loads of sex with people, and they don't have a house maybe because people just characterize them as like not wanting to work and not really thinking about the fact about why they became homeless or how they came to be that way. So that quote really resonated with me because of that case, and also I just think that the system doesn't really cater to those kind of levels of conversation or deep interventions. The system cannot seem to develop interventions that are long lasting, that can have or do what that says. And that's what Lily Allen was trying to do. She developed kind of more informal structures and had more time with young people where she could be like, actually, let's not talk about the fact that you're not taking contraception. Let's talk about your vision and what you want for your life. And then if we can talk about that, we can try and talk about how we can facilitate that and how maybe actually a kid is never going to help you reach those targets at the moment. And that's a conversation that I would love to have, but really difficult in this current system. Does anybody have any thoughts on this, or kind of like any of what I've rambled on about? No? Okay, cool. Oh, go. Yeah, go.
Hi. So the sentence that really struck me was, I wanted them to understand how to have a life. And I think with a lot of young people, you never ask them, what sort of life do you want? And actually within that, we're asking about what is it like being a part of your family and culture, or if you have a religion, or whether you're second generation and therefore there's a huge barrier between you and your parental figures, or, you know, have you considered your sexuality? Like, oh, I think I'm queer, but I'm not sure, and oh, like, I kind of want to touch this person, but I don't know how to, you know, like, so much comes before even being able to walk yourself to the STI clinic and say, I need a condom or a femidom or whatever. And I think to say, oh, go to the STI clinic is to assume so much more knowledge and self-assurance that lots of young people don't have. So that is so important. Like, these are vulva, you know?
Yeah, no, you're so right, and it's really funny because like I was in clinic yesterday, and I was actually in clinic with my senior doctors because like she was training me to do something, and you have a really short space of time, and she did actually say to this young person, kind of like, what do you want for your life? Because they weren't using contraception and they kind of like forgotten about it, and you know, they're at uni. And she was like, what? Like, no, but honestly. And the thing is, because we have such a short space of time, I watched this unfold and I was kind of like, oh my God, this seems like the worst lecture. This girl, I can see her visibly freaking out. And then like my colleague is literally like, yeah, but I kind of wanted to like frighten her because I only have this short space of time and I really need to make her think. And you know, for some people that's going to work actually. It's different strokes for different folks. But what really exactly made me feel like, oh, you know, this is why time is so key, because this person actually probably needs like a longer conversation, but you only have like 20 minutes or so people just go, don't do it, and then I think that's it. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that was from Gayatri, who is a sex educator with Sexplain and has been on DC panels before. So I guess with a good level of insight about how young people's minds and sex work. Okay, so I'm going to stop chatting because it's going to get boring speaking to me now, and I'm going to hand over to Rihanna to talk about her quotes. And each of ours are slightly different because we wanted to create a bit of variety in the conversation. So, do you want to do a spiel first?
So before I go into my quote, I kind of talk about who I am and what I do. So as I mentioned, my name is Rihanna. I work as a writer, researcher and social entrepreneur from East London. So I put in front of you a magazine which I created, and it's part of a company that I run called Shine Aloud UK. So Shine Aloud UK was created as a result of me not knowing where I wanted to fit in the industry of journalism, but also wanted to create a resource for young people to learn about sex and relationships. So it started 7 years ago, and since then it's unfolded into a big social enterprise which I now run training and do international development work overseas with Europe. But this is the issue, I think. We don't see ourselves represented. And I guess in my writing, in terms of what I write about in terms of sex and relationships and health, I try and bring it back to representation. And I think often we think some issues don't affect us because we don't see ourselves represented. So I created the magazine as a place to have a platform for young people to have a voice and sort of speak about issues that were important to them. I also go forward and speak about some of the international work. So we also have an international partnership with Erasmus, and Erasmus work in Europe, and they do different international projects with young people. And the project we're currently working on is about drugs and alcohol. And obviously, as you know, young people experiment with various different things in their life, but also at an age when you're young, you're likely to take a lot more risks. So we're looking at how drugs and alcohol impact young people's inability to make, safer decisions regarding their sexual health and relationships. And this project allows me to work in Romania, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and two partners in the UK. And as part of that experience, we take young people abroad and let them interact with young people in these settings to understand some of the issues that they face. So I think it's really important work, and I think it's important that we see ourselves represented, because if we aren't representing these spaces, we can't then begin to create, initiatives or policies that better meet our needs. So in regards to one of the quotes that I had written down, or wanted to speak about, the first one, so this one is by Marcus Garvey. A lot of people might know about Marcus Garvey, but he, I guess, is rooted in Pan-Africanism, and I guess he is the root of how other African leaders and Caribbean leaders, I guess, found the foundation for what it is to be an Africanist, and kind of central ideas about what it means to be a black person living in diaspora and aiming to kind of create, I guess, systems and foundations to grow and develop yourself as a people. So he says, "Never forget that intelligence rules the world and ignorance carries the burden. Therefore, remove yourself as far as possible from the ignorance and seek as far as possible to be intelligent." And I think it's a really important quote because it speaks to us gathering our information and not, as Annabelle spoke about, kind of picking up on what has already happened before us in terms of just regurgitating old ideas, although they're not truth and they don't have any foundation. So I guess leading on from that, through my academic experience, I looked at a survey published by NatStyle, and NatStyle stands for National Attitudes of Sexual Health and Lifestyles in the UK. and it's a survey that's published every 10 years, and it aims to capture the sexual health behaviour and attitudes of everybody in the UK. And from this data, I found that Black Caribbean women use emergency contraception more than any other ethnic group in the UK. And obviously that can be a sign of a failed contraceptive method, but also can be a sign that young Black women are accessing contraceptive services, which is really important. So as a result, I conducted a qualitative systematic review. For those of you who are not academic, it just means I looked at the data that currently exists in this area. And from that, out of the 5,000 papers that I found, only 14 of them are relevant to my study, which means that there's a lack of understanding and knowledge that exists on Black women's sexual health experiences. And if we don't understand how Black women are engaging in sexual health care, what their behaviour is, what their attitudes are, we can't design policies and programmes to better meet their needs. So as a result of that, I'm now going forward and collecting my own data on Black women's sexual health experiences to better understand their needs, with the aim of creating programmes and policies that can, I guess, address some of the issues that they're dealing with. So emergency contraception is one thing that we mentioned, but it's also other health inequalities that affect Black women in terms of higher HIV rates, in terms of domestic partner violence, difficulty negotiating condom use, and all the other issues that affect young Black women. And I think it's important that all of us, I guess everybody who identifies as Black or is in a space where they can do something, they take a lead and begin to do something that can create change. That kind of leads me to my next quote, which was about the revolution.
I'm just going to stop you, and I was just going to ask, did anybody have any kind of things that they wanted to say about kind of Marcus Garve's work, or think it relates? Or
I was going to say, I certainly can't speak to the experience of young Black women within sex in the UK, but I work in A&E in Newham, which is one of the poorest parts of London, and so the interface that I have with not just young Black women, but women from Southeast Asia, the Middle East, that come into our A&E departments, is not so much the intelligence angle of this quote, but the power of misinformation. And that comes not only through sort of fables that pass down through maybe the storytelling within families, which is incredibly culturally significant in certain populations around East London, but also the power of social media and news outlets that churn out clickbait that generates dangerous relationships with sex, with medicine, with disease. A quote like that, I think, is really powerful.
And I think, just echoing, I guess following on from what you're saying, there's a huge history of experimentation on Black bodies, and I think that does impair the way Black people, women and men, engage in sexual health care. And as Annabelle mentioned about the Tuskegee experiments, but also things like the Ralph sisters, where they were forcefully sterilised, and Fannie Lou Hamer as well, where she went in to have a hysterectomy but came out without her womb. So these things aren't jokes. People think that Black people don't want to go to get tested, or they don't want to go and get treatment, but there's a history that exists, and some of that history is based in fear and resistance. And without understanding that background, we can't begin to serve the people that need the help the most. So yeah, thank you for bringing that out. Yeah, go ahead.
I think this is interesting, especially in light of what Annabelle was just saying about the global gag rule, just because in talking about how it came to be, when it came about in the United States, it was implemented a year after Roe v. Wade was passed, which was the legislation that legalized abortion in the U.S. And so it was this small lobby of people who felt like, okay, well, we can't stop people from having abortions in the U.S., so we can go and implement this policy worldwide and make sure that worldwide people receiving our funds are no longer able to do this. And the gag rule is so bad just because it goes well beyond saying, well, these organizations, they cannot provide abortions using our funds already, that those policies already exist. They can't provide abortions using their own funds, but then it goes one step further to say that doctors can't even speak on abortion unless a woman comes and presents herself and meets these 4 specific things. She says explicitly that she's already pregnant, that she wants to have an abortion, that she knows that abortion is legal in her country, and then if the doctor feels that the medical ethics of the country permit them to say something, then they can. So it really it says a lot about the way in which I think a lot of institutions recognize how intelligent schools the world, and in creating policies like this, they're able to ensure that this ignorance still exists.
Of course.
It's disturbing.
Yeah, it is. Thank you for that. Yeah.
A very knowledgeable, fantastic summary. Thanks so much. And I think you've already done this, but I think it just speaks to so much how people often think about like national policy and really just think about our own experience. But sexual reproductive health, I think, so much is one of those fields where it's so interlinked to kind of like global health and people's agenda there, and then it directly feeds into what people try and implement here, or if they can't implement something in our own country, then they get frustrated and they try and kind of do their politics on a global level, and usually that ends with the reproductive rights of people of colour being impinged upon. Sorry, I think somebody had a comment. Yeah.
Question. The research that you did from that cell sounds really interesting.
Thank you.
And I can't believe it was just so shocking that there were only 14 cases.
Yeah.
But you said that you were collecting data yourself now.
Yeah.
What data are you collecting?
Sorry, yeah. So the data that I did find, the reason why I guess it's not representative, 14 is not enough to get, I guess, a good sample size, but also didn't exclusively represent the voices of black women. When there were women involved in the research study, it only put like women and women of all different colours, and it's not particular to young people. So if it's young women under 25, young women over 25, just all women together. So going forward, the data that I want to collect is looking at emergency contraception use, but also things around pleasure and STIs, accessing sexual health services, domestic violence, all various different issues, because if we don't understand what exists for black women, how can we better support them or meet their needs? So this is something I'm currently designing with the hope of launching later in summer 2020 going forward. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and you also said.
Yeah, I had a question, but she asked it
Okay.
already, so it's
Cool. Okay. Yeah.
I've got a question, but I'm not really sure like how much anyone can actually answer this. So like it's kind of on the idea of intelligence and ignorance, and not really like actual ignorance, but maybe just like misinformation or lack of information. So obviously the fact that like sexual health isn't really massively spoken about in the world, in schools and that sort of thing, where it kind of needs to be spoken about. But then also like the sexual health of like trans men and women, for instance, that's something that personally I've never kind of come across. And I don't really like. So I'm a queer man. I had to kind of grow up like trying to find out about sexual health of queer men specifically on my own. I can imagine that's a similar experience for like trans men and women. And like, how do we? I guess the question kind of how do we break that cycle? What do we do in order to make sure that that is something that people can actually access and aren't ignorant about or don't know about those things? If that makes sense.
No, I understand what you mean. I think it starts with us, I guess, creating the content, creating the work and making sure people have the accurate education they need. And I think for a long time of my life, for the last 10 years, I've been working with young people and educating young people about sex and relationships in different forms in terms of workshops and presentations, different things. But it made me think that if we are only educating young people about sex and relationships and not educating adults, it almost seems redundant because we can't expect young people to, I guess, they have confidence, of course, but if the adults in their lives aren't enforcing the same messages, then it kind of falls on deaf ears. So I think we have a responsibility to educate everyone about sexual health needs of all populations.
Just because I'm aware of time, we will come back to your question because I actually think it's really important. I think all of us will have something to say along those lines. Obviously, we can't speak to the trans experience because I'm not sure anybody here or myself identifies that way, but it's something that I'm really conscious of trying to elevate in our work, especially like I wrote an article for Galthem about like queer history and coloniality and how it's really changed our perceptions of like identities in certain communities, and how that's actually quite fundamental for conversations we're trying to have in terms of, say, actually these populations existed in some communities for quite some time, and actually our ideas have shifted because of some of the history that you don't know or what we have been told or haven't been told, and use that to say actually you need to readjust your thinking, but also screw your thinking, these people have always existed, and give them their space. So we will talk about that again, but I just want to make sure we have enough time for Phil.
So the second quote is about revolution. So you can kill the revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution. And I think this is a very powerful quote from Afeni Shakur, who is Tupac's mother. She was a part of the Black Panthers part of the Black Panthers in the US, but she was also part of a Black Panther trial called Black Panther 21. in where a lot of the people as part of the movement were sort of convicted for something they didn't do, and she took it upon herself to represent herself in court and managed to get the court acquitted. But it speaks to sort of the work that people are doing in this space. This work is not new. Reproductive justice doesn't just come about. A lot of black women and black people in this space have been doing this work for years, and it's ongoing work because things are changing, but things are also the same. And I think it speaks to how much more needs to be done and needs to be funded, needs to be understood in order for us to create change going forward. So I'll move on to the last quote, which I have. What's that? So this is by Audre Lorde. So there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And I think this speaks to the complexity of our lives and intersectionality. So in terms of me being a black woman from working class background, I also have a hidden disability, which is dyslexia. So all these different issues play into how I'm received and how people respond to me in the world, but there's so many other people in the world with different issues. And I think it's really important to remember that. I think we spoke about it before in terms of if you're in a clinical setting, you see someone, they might come for one thing, but due to all the other issues in their lives or the challenges they experience as a person, you then end up dealing with so many more things. So I'll give an example. As I said, I work as a sexual health advisor in a clinic, and unlike Annabelle, I guess I have a bit more time to speak with people about different issues that they may come in for. So I saw a young woman came in last week, and she was frantic because she felt she had caught HIV because she had anal sex. And obviously you can't just catch HIV just from having anal sex, but a lot of the rhetoric around, people who have anal sex are more at risk and things like that. So I spoke to her about, I guess, her concerns and the type of sex she was having, and because she had vaginal sex and anal sex with this person, but when she had vaginal sex, she didn't think she had HIV, but she had anal sex, and that sort of made her just really frantic. And through that conversation, we was able to speak and understand there's a lot more stuff going on for her. So she recently come out of a divorce. She felt like she has anxiety and depression. She's been signed off work. She feels she's experiencing some sort of racism at work as well. She felt like she had lost herself after having children. So as you can see, she came in for one thing, but through the conversation I had with her, there was so much more going on for her. But obviously people might see someone and just think, oh, she's overreacting or a hypochondriac, but the conversation that you have leads to much more going on for that person. So I just think it's really important to understand that people have really complex lives, and we see people as they are, but there's so much more to them, basically.
Thank you. Great, amazing. I also love this quote, and there's usually a kind of diagram I show in like other lectures about like intersectionality, and I think I'm sure most people probably have come across the term before, and it's a much abused term now. Maybe only decolonialism is second. But in terms of what it is and what it means the various facets of people's identity, and the Combahee River Collective in the US kind of first spoke about identity politics in this way, and then the term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's very much about acknowledging that these different facets contribute to people's experiences of oppression and the additional barriers they face. And I think one of the key issues that's actually overlooked a lot is like historic trauma, actually, and is part of why we're doing. I don't think it's the whole reason, but when you look at all of those various things, I think we're getting better at being like, yes, racism, and being like ableism, and being like your sexuality, but I think we're really bad at being like, actually a lot of groups of people have generational trauma, not necessarily even just racial generational trauma, but like if you've come from a family which had lots of mental health issues, or had lots of has historically been quite abusive, then that person's carrying a lot more weight, and the playing field isn't even, and I think more needs to be done around that. Anyway, we will move on and round off, so we have time to drink some of this wine that's been left with us. To Phil, who's got like a different take on things.
Before I start, can we give these two women a round of applause, please? It's not often that black women are usually heard as much as men, so it's nice that we have this dynamic. I guess talking about my work, I do a lot of writing around stuff around sexual health in general. I do a lot of stuff on PrEP. I use social media quite often. I'm quite prolific on social media. I do campaigns. I do all sorts. I do talks like this, and I really focus on honest visibility and representation, sort of similar to what Rihanna does. And I just think it's so important that we're in a lot of the services that we use. We're in a lot of the campaigns that we see, you know. And I think it's really important that we're there because there's like, what is it? There's nothing for us without us. So yeah, I don't know which order the quotes are in, but mine are really random. So just say it for this one. I'm gonna read it first, and then I'll explain it after. So I'm sick to death of people who are not like me, telling me what I should do with my sex life. I don't want a straight heterosexual woman who is sitting in an office in a public health building somewhere saying, "Hi Karen, why can't gay men just wear condoms? I'm sorry Karen, I'm not interested." Nobody ever asked straight people this question. So this was by a colleague of mine, Greg Owen. So Greg is the founder of I Want PrEP Now. We used to work together when I worked at THT. And I decided to use this, although he's white, because I feel like it's a type of quote that it's transferable. Although he is a cis white gay man, like I feel like this can cover a lot of different demographics that might feel very similar. So that's why I chose this one. I wanted to be funny as
well. So in terms of, first of all, I Want PrEP Now is a wonderful resource that was established, I think, before a lot of other resources were. In terms of PrEP, PrEP is pre-exposure prophylaxis. So we had PEP, which you take after you've been exposed to HIV. Now we have pre-exposure prophylaxis for people that may be exposed to HIV, either because their partner has HIV and is not on treatment or is not undetectable, or may be having sex with people that have high rates of HIV, like men who have sex with men. And we use that term because not everyone thinks that makes them or considers themselves gay, and that's why we use men who have sex with men as a term. So that is a wonderful resource, and Greg Owen is doing the most, so I think fair play. And I think there's a lot to be said about people sitting in public health buildings, to be honest, and strategizing, and all they get, and I think people would be like fairly appalled to know how public health data is collected, not because people don't want it to be better, but because the system is finite. We like code our data, a patient comes in and you become a T4, C5, whatever, and that just means I gave you treatment for chlamydia, and I had a chat and I did like X or Y swabs, and then that goes off to public health, and that's how they work out kind of what's happening and trends. And it really is, people become a number, and in sexual health it works so badly, but it's the only way we can kind of develop interventions and get an idea of mapping. And it's only really recently people have started to look at like disaggregated data, and what I mean by that is looking at the fact that we aren't all the same. So historically there's been quite a lot of like BAME, like putting like Black, Asian, minority, ethnic data kind of all into one melting pot, and not disentangling the fact that actually it's not all of this demographic. Actually, for some things it's just Asian people that, you know, might struggle with access to services, or I'm not saying all of what I'm saying is necessarily true, but for example, or we have higher rates of this in the Black population, and then even subdividing that data, because in the recent Public Health England data, for example, is mainly, you know, some rates of STIs, it's Black Caribbean men specifically that are struggling. HIV is increasing in Black African population. It seems really silly to probably everybody else here, but it's actually just been going on for a really long time, and that's why some of this work has been so difficult, because we're obviously like, we're not the same, and to people that are not part of this demographic, they kind of just go, the issues are the same. Anyway, I'll let you move on, sorry. Did anybody have anything to say about this, or Karen? No? No? Back, Karen?
Okay, this one is from Mark Thompson, who's my mentor and the co-founder of Prepstar, where I work. He said, I'm on HIV treatment and that costs a significant amount of money, whereas PrEP is cheaper. So it just seems like a no-brainer. I think back when I was diagnosed, which was 30 years ago, I was a young black man. So I had all the prevention needs you can imagine. I would have been a perfect candidate for PrEP if it had been available. I certainly would have taken it and I would have been one less infection. So this was about 4 years ago, written by someone else that I know actually. And I chose this because I find Mark quite inspirational in general. And I feel like there's, especially at this moment in time where Frank Ocean did this thing on, he did a party in New York, and it was something like PrEP Plus, I think it was called. And it was something about what would the 80s have been like if PrEP was available then. So it's kind of, I thought it'd be interesting to go with this one. Yeah, I think that's it.
Does this speak to anybody kind of like in the room, or obviously we will have space for questions after Phil's finished, but is there anything specifically about this quote that people feel really resonates or they find kind of challenging or even upsetting? Yeah.
I think PrEP is kind of a primary example of health inequality in
Yep.
the country today. because
Massively.
There are limited spaces on a trial called Impact, which is how people access PrEP via the NHS in England at the moment. And the disparity between the number of white, particularly in the men who have sex with men, if we talk about that demographic particularly, the disparity between the number of white people that have got access to that trial versus the number of black people or other minority ethnic groups is huge. And part of it, I think, is due to the fact that sometimes it comes back to that idea of intersectionality that we were talking about, where sometimes black MSMs are excluded from gay spaces, so they don't have that ability to then get the knowledge around it. Part of it is also because of the stigma associated with being a black person who's MSM, and it's just very upsetting that it's a primary exam, and it means that people who are black are getting more HIV infections because they're not being offered or they don't know about PrEP. And Frank Ocean got a lot of stick actually for that.
I heard that apparently a lot of white attendees were there. But I haven't read into it a lot, but there was one article that came up where people that went said that there was a lot of white people there, so I don't know.
Yeah,
quickly.
no, go for it, yeah.
There was some research that came out from the London School actually very recently, which said just that part of the barriers for black men anyway accessing PrEP in London aged between 18 and 45, one of their things was that they don't go to a lot of gay spaces. So because of that, then they're not getting a lot of the messages. So yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, I feel like a lot of the reasons that information is not
Sorry,
disseminated.
I can't hear you that well from here.
I'll repeat it, don't worry.
Sorry, I feel like a lot of the reasons that the information is not disseminated to, especially black men, is, I guess, the culture in this country is not as focused on HIV prevention as you would see in perhaps an African country, where it's always in the forefront. It's like, oh, we have an issue. Whereas here, I feel like it's like a bit more relaxed. It's like, oh, it's not that big of an issue. Like, only some people.
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Did everyone hear
Sorry,
that?
I got it. There's two things on there actually. So it's hilarious because London is a fast track city. So we actually, generally, we do really well with HIV. But
So what does that mean, just for jargon? People might not know what
Fast Track City is one of the cities that is basically leading in HIV prevention. Yes, okay. But there's still a lot of issues, and I think the problem with England and particularly London, although a lot of stuff can be very, a lot of sexual health in general can be very London-centric, there's issues with demographics, I think, and like breaking down, just like Annabelle said. And for example, when I'm on the PrEP Impact trial, and when I went for my first appointment, they didn't let me get on it, even though I'm black, African, and gay, and 3 different groups that are disproportionately affected by HIV. So it's ridiculous.
Just picking up on your point a bit more as well, is that I think that one of the things is about, first of all, yes, to the fact that in terms of the impact trial, the fact that we are campaigning, and I've written about this elsewhere, and there's lots of links on our website. HIV is like the epitome of how sexual health has been colonised and is colonised in terms of the history. And a lot of people of our generation, of this age, don't know the history, but people campaigned very hard to get access to antiretroviral drugs. And then when they were created, they were only disseminated to very few, mainly white, wealthy people in the US after Black Africans were experimented on to develop those treatments, like purified versions released in Western countries. So if you look at that history, it's kind of the epitome of how sexual reproductive health needs have kind of played out. And with the impact trial, it's we're in an environment where sexual health services are being cut, and we don't have data, which is always very key, because then people can't say we can't show anything, right? That if you cut sexual health services, the people that suffer are going to be black and brown people, because the data shows we have the worst sexual health. But we can't actually show any correlation between the cuts to services and worsening need, because that research hasn't been done. Nor can we actually show that not giving people space on the impact trial is actually making keeping HIV rates in certain populations like the black community stable, in terms of like they're rising or they're still elevated compared to white gay men, for example, who are on the impact trial. It follows, and we kind of know, but like there isn't like robust data for anybody to point out and say this is actually what you're perpetuating by not giving open access to this treatment. And that's so fundamental, because if you don't have any data, you are just advocating on a feeling and a fact that something makes sense. And I cannot tell you, all of you that are researchers and are locked into academia here, and this is why the work of people like Rihanna is so important, that if you can't find numbers, you really can't push the conversation forward, because people will tell you things are fictional. And sometimes there's a huge lag as well in terms of us generating the data and the damage already being done. So like we have a cure, we know that it's good to go. As Mark said, he would have benefited from this 30 years ago. We're all kind of rooming and ahhing. Nobody has any money, so we just leave it. And our rates of HIV are just doing this. And then we'll look 10 years and be like, oh, technically, in terms of like impact, we could have prevented probably another 10,000 HIV infections. And that's kind of what happened, and it's really, really sad. But yes, it's really awful. And then just picking up on the last point at the back, that one of the reasons that, yeah, you're absolutely right, we don't focus on preventative measures here, but this all goes back to, I think, what the demographic is and who is considered important. Because if you look at the raw data, Black Africans, particularly black gay men, are disproportionately represented in our HIV statistics. And do they have any political power? They do not. So prevention measures are not on the agenda, okay? And the reason HIV treatment, a lot of it got on the agenda, is because of white gay men who were in political power positions, who were dying. And that was the issue. So unless you have people advocating for people in that way, things will not progress. Just to round off, sorry, I feel like I hijacked that last quote a little bit. You take, so that's the article it's from. So if any of you want to go off and read the article, it's quite an old article now. I think it was written about 5 years ago, and it was written with the Terence Higgins Trust. And then this one's pulled from a Galvin article.
I love this article. This is from, I'll read it first actually. Research shows time again that communities of colour are asking for sexual health education and services through broader means than just a sexual health clinic, be it from face-to-face outreach, school education, social media, or more mainstream advertising. This does mean, however, providing funding for organisations outside of the traditional sexual health spheres and recognising the nuances of this delivery, such as who is delivering this information and how. So this is from an article by Daniel de Block Golding for Galdem, and like it's we need to share this after this. It's such a great piece of writing in the sense of how it covered, although it's mostly targeted at black women, it does cover communities of color. And similar to how I took that quote from Greg and I said, basically this can kind of apply to a lot of different things. This article does just that. And it came out about a month ago, and I just thought it was an incredible piece of writing and it can be used quite widely.
Yeah, so please go and read it. Loads of us have written articles, like Rihanna's written one, I think, for The Independent. I write a column for Galvin about these things, and a lot of the stuff that we've spoken about today, and we've written about elsewhere. Realise that writing is not just one way to access people, because a lot of people don't, or struggle like we do with dyslexia, and reading's not great. But you can also listen to us, like we jump on podcasts. Gayatri went on Viva Vulva Resolution, like and you can go back and listen to those all because they are just on the internet forever. And we speak about these issues in more detail to like different people, so that's like a really good way of kind of getting what we're saying in more depth. So going to open up to the floor for a few questions, but it might just be easier if you just catch us because we're going to just be drinking some wine and eating some snacks and showing you our Decolonising Contraception bookshelf. Basically, I'll get up now. The bookshelf is a collection of books which along the line, we have like our busy WhatsApp group, and people have said along the way that this has really helped them, or it's really resonated with them, or it's really helped me on my journey of understanding and putting some of this into focus and just building knowledge. We have a reading list on under the blog section of our website, but feel free to flick through these books. These are just a selection of books, and some of them are just ones that I want to read now. Some of them are fictional, such as The Black Flamingo by Dean Atter, which are just, well, it's semi-autobiographical, and that is just about his experience as a black gay man and coming to terms with, like, in terms of his identity. And then some of them are much more political, like Medical Apartheid, which are written by Harriet Washington and discusses experimentation on black Americans and just gives you lots of knowledge about that. So quite variable, but kind of builds a whole context. Follow us on social media. I'm really passionate about the fact that increasingly, like, for marginalised demographics, social media is a way to reach people because people don't feel comfortable having these conversations in person, but they will slip into your DMs, or they will like a post, or they'll say, yes, more of this please, or less of this, or this doesn't make sense to me, because they don't feel comfortable having this conversation in person, or they actually feel like genuinely unsafe about declaring certain things in an open space. So yeah, these are some of the books on the reading list. Lots of great stuff that Loretta Ross in the US has written about reproductive justice, and that's the book that I took a few of the quotes from at the beginning in terms of Heart of the Race, kind of one of the best texts we have in terms of black women's experiences in Britain at the moment. And we have an event Gayatri and I are doing on the 12th of November. So we're trying to do lots of different things. Some of it's more academic, some of it's just like about making people feel comfortable. So we're doing an event in a sex shop in East London about sexual pleasure for women and non-binary people of colour. Some of our events are going to be a bit more specific in terms of the communities they're for. But this was just because essentially a lot of certain different demographics do not feel comfortable entering into like a sex shop or space, but they have lots of questions, and sex ed is an ongoing process, so it's a bit of like a sex ed for adults. So we'll be discussing like anatomy and like toys and pleasure, and just like ask us random questions between the two of us, and there'll be like drinks and chill afterwards. Okay. And then just to round up that, thanks. And in April next year, we're going to have a sexual health festival as well, to discuss some of more academic stuff, but then also some stuff along the lines of the thing I mentioned, which will just be talking about like pleasure and well-being and mental health in relation to sexual health. Did anyone have any questions? No, I'll just round off in terms of your question then, so I didn't catch your name. In terms of, I think you were saying like trans health and trans experience. So there is a fabulous doctor in Brighton called Kate Nabia, who runs clinic, is it Clinic T or Q, her one?
There's the one in Brighton.
T, okay, so the one in Dean Street is Q, isn't it? So
I think I've moved from
They've moved from then. There's a new service, okay. So that's trans-specific health, sexual health service, and she's done loads of work, and the British Association of Sexual Health and HIV BASH have just developed guidelines for trans and non-binary people in sexual health services, and there are lots of great people trying to mobilise around that issue, specifically like people of colour trying to recognise that the needs are great and severe. One thing that I don't quite understand, and I was kind of like upset by, is that actually in the PrEP guidelines it's not one of the key target populations in terms of trans black women to be like automatically given kind of like PrEP access, which actually I think, and again I think that might go back to data, because people can't justify something if you don't collect data on a population, and when you go into a sexual health clinic there hasn't been very good data collection on like trans.
They did actually change that recently in the impact trial. You now have to put if someone's...
No, so that for the impact trial, yes, but I mean in terms of when you generally go to sexual health clinic, until fairly recently pro formers weren't very good at identifying if the patient was trans, and the public data that goes to Public Health England doesn't tell you. So like that wasn't picked up on before. I think they've modified it, but those were some of the issues that were happening. You can't advocate for people that don't exist, and people like to make people not exist. So yeah, on that note, feel free to grab a drink. Also, we're operating with no money. So if you feel like donating and grabbing a badge and throwing your change in and contributing so we can do more events and talks and stuff, please do. Thanks so much.